According to the Ukrainian Air Force, Russia launched another large-scale attack on Ukraine on the night of December 6, 653. Shahed-type kamikaze drones, 36 cruise missiles, and 17 ballistic missiles were fired at targets across the country, a total of 60 attacks in 29 locations. At the same time, authorities from Kyiv, Odesa, Zaporizhzhia, and other regions reported powerful explosions burning substations and damaged power plants. The pressure on the already severely strained energy system is rising dramatically while the population must prepare for nationwide rolling blackouts. Particularly alarming, according to the operator Ukrenergo, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant lost external power supply for about half an hour for the 11th time since the beginning of the war, before only one of two critical lines could be reconnected. President Volodymyr Zelensky wrote on Telegram that the attacks were once again primarily aimed at energy infrastructure, a message reflecting both helplessness and growing frustration in Kyiv. In parallel, the Russian channel RT reported that former Ukrainian Prime Minister Mykola Azarov sees a scenario in which the USA could remove Zelensky if Washington were to consider him an obstacle to a peace deal. Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin also openly questions the legitimacy of the Ukrainian president, citing martial law and the fact that no elections were held in May 2024, while a corruption scandal in the energy sector worth more than 100 million euros has already led to several high-level resignations in Kyiv. Is the military disaster at the front now threatening to turn into a political earthquake in which Zelensky himself becomes a pawn of foreign interests? Welcome to our channel, a platform where we classify international events with journalistic precision, clear analysis, and an eye for context. The latest developments in Ukraine once again underline how deeply military escalation and political destabilization are intertwined, while the country suffers under the heaviest airstrikes in months and key energy facilities fail. Pressure on President Volodymyr Zelensky grows both from internal crises and from signals abroad. Particularly explosive is that the debate over his political future is no longer taking place only inside Ukraine but also in Western capitals, where questions about legitimacy, capability, and the government's direction are being raised more openly. Why are doubts intensifying precisely now? What role do the massive corruption scandal, the cancelled elections, and the strategic interests of the United States play in a possible scenario of his loss of power? And above all, what does the combination of military pressure and political uncertainty mean for Europe's stability and for the further course of the war? These are the questions we examine in today's analysis. On December 6th, the Ukrainian Air Force reported a new peak of Russian air activity. 653 Shahed-type kamikaze drones, 36 cruise missiles, and 17 ballistic missiles were launched at targets across the country. The attacks affected 29 locations, and throughout the night, air raid sirens sounded almost continuously in numerous regions. The Ministry of Energy announced severe damage to transmission systems, while cities such as Kyiv, Odesa, Dnipro, and Zaporizhzhia reported outages and infrastructural destruction. Particularly concerning was the situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. According to the energy operator Ukrenergo, it lost external power supply for the 11th time since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. For around 30 minutes, the facility was cut off from the national grid, a state that, according to experts, poses significant risks as the reactors depend on stable cooling systems. Although one of two emergency lines could be restored afterward, the situation was classified as extremely unstable. President Volodymyr Zelensky reacted with sharp words. Russia is once again targeting our energy system. This is terror against our civilian infrastructure. He emphasized that repairs were already underway but warned that the country must prepare for temporary rolling blackouts. Energy Minister Herman Halushchenko described the scale of the strikes as one of the most extensive attacks in months. Parallel to this, political pressure on the Ukrainian leadership grew. Footage circulated online showing alleged infrastructure corruption cases involving officials of the Ministry of Energy, which, according to Ukrainian media, had led to resignations and criminal investigations totaling over 100 million euros. While Kyiv publicly sought to present unity, Russian media worked to portray the Ukrainian leadership as divided and weakened. The Russian channel RT quoted former Ukrainian Prime Minister Mykola Azarov, who claimed that the United States could remove Zelensky if Washington were to consider him an obstacle to a negotiated settlement. For Moscow, this narrative plays into a broader strategy. President Vladimir Putin repeatedly emphasizes that Zelensky's term in office has formally expired since no elections were held in May 2024 due to martial law. According to Putin, this calls into question the president's legitimacy, a position widely rejected by Western governments but still used by the Kremlin for information warfare. These parallel developments, military escalation, infrastructure collapse, political pressure, create an atmosphere in which even small failures could lead to larger crises. The events of December 6th can only be understood against the background of the developments of recent years, which have created an increasing interconnection between military escalation and political pressure. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Ukraine's energy system has become one of the central targets of Russian attacks, not only with the aim of weakening military logistics, but also with the intention of causing social destabilization. The winter months always represent a particularly vulnerable phase, as damage to heating plants, substations, and high-voltage lines has immediate impacts on millions of people. The repeated outages at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant therefore highlight a critical risk. Since the beginning of the war, the facility has repeatedly been temporarily cut off from external power supply, leaving the cooling systems dependent on backup generators. International organizations such as the IAEA have repeatedly warned that such situations could trigger unpredictable consequences. Parallel to this, internal political developments have intensified pressure on the Ukrainian leadership. Corruption scandals, especially those involving the energy sector, have damaged trust in certain government institutions. According to Ukrainian investigative media, several high-ranking officials are being investigated for mismanagement, overpricing, and the misuse of funds intended for energy infrastructure. The total value of the alleged damage is estimated to exceed 100 million euros. In this context, the question of Zelensky's legitimacy has also become a political instrument. Due to martial law, the presidential elections scheduled for May 2024 were suspended, a constitutionally and internationally recognized step. Nevertheless, the Kremlin is using this as part of its information strategy. Vladimir Putin repeatedly claims that Zelensky has no mandate, although Russia does not recognize any Ukrainian elections unless they take place under its own conditions. The debate gained momentum when on December 2nd, contents of a confidential conversation among European heads of state and government became public. According to the revealed information, several leaders expressed concern that Ukraine could soon lose political and financial support unless the government presented clearer long-term security concepts. Particularly explosive were the alleged statements by France's President Emmanuel Macron, who, according to the document, warned Zelensky that the United States could tilt on territorial issues if Ukraine did not adjust its diplomatic position. Chancellor Friedrich M. also reportedly advised caution, while Finland's President Alexander Stubb emphasized that Europe must prevent Ukraine from being pushed into a weaker negotiating position. These discussions highlight a central dilemma. While Western support for Ukraine remains strong, internal tensions, corruption scandals, and the massive Russian attacks raise questions about Kyiv's long-term resilience. The events of December 6th, therefore, represent a point at which military escalation and political uncertainty increasingly converge, a combination that has the potential to influence the strategic direction of the war. At the operational level, the events of December 6th show how strongly Russia is now combining different weapon systems to exert maximum pressure on Ukraine's infrastructure. The simultaneous use of Shahed drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles is intended to overwhelm Ukraine's air defense, create overload effects, and hit several energy nodes at once. According to Ukrainian experts, the goal is not only to destroy substations, but also to force repeated shutdowns of entire networks so that the power supply becomes unstable over the long term. The strikes on districts in Odesa, Dnipro, and Zaporizhzhia show that Russia is pursuing a strategy aimed at simultaneously damaging transmission lines, heating plants, and reserve capacities with the intention of making repairs increasingly difficult. The fact that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant lost its external power supply again underscores how vulnerable even the most critical facilities are. Each power outage increases the risk that technical failures could occur that no longer remain controllable. The high number of intercepted drones, 195 within 24 hours according to Russian sources, also shows that UAV warfare has now reached a level where both sides are deploying swarms of drones in parallel with classical missile systems. For Ukraine, this means that the front and the rear areas must be protected simultaneously, which places air defense under enormous strain. Furthermore, each successful strike on the energy infrastructure increases the logistical burden on the military, as generators, fuel, and repair crews have to be redirected from the front. Parallel to these military developments, political pressure is increasing. Corruption scandals in the energy sector weaken the credibility of Ukraine's leadership at precisely the moment when Russia is focusing heavily on infrastructure attacks. International analysts warn that weakening public trust could ultimately affect mobilization, readiness, and the ability to withstand prolonged strain. The leaked European meeting protocol adds another level of tension, as it shows that Western governments are discussing Zelensky's political future more openly than before. This combination, military escalation, infrastructural overload, and political pressure, creates a dynamic that is difficult to control. The decisive question now is whether Ukraine can stabilize its energy system in time, and whether political leadership will succeed in restoring confidence while simultaneously managing war-related challenges. The international reactions to the events of December 6th reveal how much the war in Ukraine has now become intertwined with global political tensions. In Washington, several commentators openly discussed whether the United States might increase pressure on Kyiv if internal political instability were to intensify. Particularly noteworthy was a segment on the Russian channel RT in which former Ukrainian Prime Minister Mykola Azarov claimed that the United States could remove Zelensky if he were to become an obstacle to a negotiated settlement, a speculation that Kyiv categorically rejects, but which fuels the information war. At the same time, the debate over Zelensky's legitimacy is gaining geopolitical weight. Although the postponement of presidential elections due to martial law is recognized under international law, the Kremlin repeatedly uses this point to portray the Ukrainian leadership as weakened. Russian President Vladimir Putin emphasized once again that Zelensky has no mandate, even though Russia does not recognize any Ukrainian leadership unless it aligns with its own interests. European reactions are mixed. While governments continue to affirm their support for Ukraine, leaked internal discussions show that some capitals are increasingly concerned about Kyiv's political stability and the long-term feasibility of current strategies. The statements attributed to France's Emmanuel Macron, according to which the United States could tilt on territorial questions, underscore how much diplomatic pressure is currently building behind the scenes. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich M. and Finland's President Alexander Stubb also reportedly warned that Ukraine must not be pushed into a negotiation position that could weaken its sovereignty. Parallel to this, the northeastern European states are urging stronger support. Countries such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia emphasized that the attacks on Ukraine's energy system represent a direct threat to European security, as they increase the risk of humanitarian crises, refugee movements, and further destabilization. International organizations also reacted. The IAEA warned once again that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remains in an unacceptably fragile state, as repeated power outages could lead to an emergency situation at any time. Human rights groups sharply criticized the Russian strike patterns and called for increased international monitoring of attacks on civilian infrastructure. Overall, the situation shows that Ukraine is under triple pressure militarily through the heaviest attacks in months, infrastructurally through the collapse of essential energy systems, and politically through growing uncertainty about the country's leadership and international support. The developments of December 6th open several possible scenarios for the coming week's scenarios that differ significantly depending on how Ukraine-Russia and the international community react. In the worst-case scenario, Russia would intensify its attacks on Ukraine's energy system even further. If the rate of strikes, 653 drones, 36 cruise missiles, and 17 ballistic missiles in a single night continues, or even increases, Ukraine could face a massive collapse of heating, electricity, and communication infrastructures. Rolling blackouts could become permanent and winter repairs would lag behind destruction, and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant would remain in a dangerously unstable condition. Such a development would also have political consequences. Growing dissatisfaction among the population, weakened trust in state institutions, and increasing criticism from abroad toward Zelensky's leadership. Russia could then attempt to exploit the internal strain through intensified information operations and targeted diplomatic pressure. A medium scenario assumes that Ukraine can stabilize the situation despite enormous strain. Repairs would continue, energy outages would remain temporary, and the air defense would adapt to the mixed attack pattern of drones and missiles. Politically, the government would succeed in containing the corruption scandal and presenting Western partners with a coherent concept for long-term security. Military pressure would remain high, but Ukraine would maintain a functioning defensive capability, even though certain regions might suffer prolonged disruptions. Russia would continue trying to destabilize the country, but would not achieve a decisive breakthrough. In the best-case scenario, Ukraine succeeds in counteracting Russia's winter strategy. Air defense systems are strengthened. Western partners accelerate deliveries of interceptors and generators, and the energy grid is stabilized through emergency infrastructure measures. Diplomatically clear agreements could be reached between Kyiv and its partners, reducing uncertainty about future support. At the same time, the political pressure on Zelensky could ease if the corruption investigations lead to credible reforms and the international community signals unity. In such a situation, Russia's attempt to combine military escalation with political destabilization would not achieve the intended effect. Across all scenarios, one factor remains decisive: Ukraine's ability to protect its energy infrastructure and maintain internal political cohesion is directly linked to its capacity to continue the war effort. If stability in these areas falters simultaneously, the consequences could be far-reaching both domestically and internationally. The events of December 6th illustrate how quickly the situation in Ukraine can shift when military pressure, infrastructural breakdowns, and political uncertainty occur simultaneously. Russia's massive drone and missile attacks reveal a clear strategy to weaken Ukraine's operational capability, overload the energy system, and undermine public confidence in the government. The fact that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant once again lost external power supply underscores the risks that even facilities of global importance cannot be protected permanently. At the same time, the political dimension of the crisis is becoming increasingly evident. The corruption scandal in the energy sector, the postponed presidential elections, and the leaked concerns of European heads of state place President Volodymyr Zelensky under additional pressure that is being actively exploited by Russian information campaigns. Statements by former Ukrainian Prime Minister Mykola Azarov, who suggested that the United States could remove Zelensky if necessary, illustrate how far-reaching such narratives have become in international media arenas. Meanwhile, Western governments face a dilemma. On the one hand, they want to support Ukraine militarily and politically. On the other hand, internal instability in Kyiv could raise doubts about long-term strategies and the feasibility of continued aid. For Ukraine, the coming weeks will therefore be a test of resilience. Can the energy system be stabilized despite massive damage? Will the political leadership succeed in addressing corruption scandals and maintaining public trust? And will the international community remain united if the crisis escalates further? These questions will decisively shape the dynamics of the conflict far beyond the events of a single day. We will keep you informed about all developments. If you do not want to miss any of our analyses in the future, subscribe to our channel, leave a comment, and share the video. Your support helps us continue to report independently and thoroughly.